LGBTI people are affected in just the same ways as everyone else in terms of potentially their homes or their businesses being damaged or destroyed. But the experiences that LGBTI people face that are different relate to the way in which their lives are lived and the way in which society both tolerates or doesn't tolerate the existence of people who are different to the mainstream. So, for example, in the work that we've been able to do in the project we're working on at the moment, we've found that many individuals talk about experiences that increase their vulnerability. So for many individual LGBTI people or couples, they may have chosen not to come out into the wider community or to their families for a variety of reasons. So for a couple to then seek support from government in the post-disaster response or recovery phase, there may be fear about stigmatisation or being considered different or not worthy of the support that affects them in a material way, may amplify pre-existing mental health conditions. And we know that mental health is generally poorer for the LGBTI community than it is in the wider community. So having experiences that are quite negative in shelters or recovery centres can amplify pre-existing senses of being at the margins of society or not having the same rights as everybody else. And we do know that across the Australian states and territories, jurisdictions vary in terms of their inclusion under law or exclusion. So that can make people feel very much vulnerable or marginalised in post-disaster situations. LGBTI people can experience a greater sense of loss in relationship to homes. So once again, sort of often LGBTI people who haven't come out create a very safe space inside their home in a way that sort of straight or heterosexual people won't necessarily experience in the same way. And when the home is lost, those safe protective walls around that individual, that couple and family, come crumbling down, and that once again can amplify senses of vulnerability or stress and anxiety that's felt in the post-disaster situation. So some things are very obvious and other things are much more subtle, but they can really influence the nature of the disaster impacts, and they can spread out over prolonged periods of time. The people that we've spoke to have had both positive and negative experiences, and I really want to make that clear that it varies on locations. Communities can be very inclusive, but other communities, there's variation as we'd expect, and some individuals find it difficult to tolerate or to make friends with or to understand and accept people who are different to themselves. So some LGBTI people, same-sex families with dependent children, have had negative experiences around feeling that they're less worthy, being judged by other people. Some individuals have reported verbal abuse about how it's unfair on the children that they have in their family because they've got two mums, or a diverse parenting mix. That somehow is going to harm the children in the long term. And in the stress of the post-disaster situation, you're in an evacuation shelter, you don't know whether the home you've had to leave is safe or not, whether you've lost everything or not. To have such negative experiences just once again raises the tension that LGBTI people can face in the confines of such a place. Some gay men have reported that they've received verbal abuse when going into bathrooms. Some straight men don't like being in close proximity to other gay men in the bathrooms, the toilets, the shower rooms. And gay men have experienced some sort of negative experiences in terms of verbal abuse and intimidation in terms of being present in those confined spaces. Within our own study, transgendered and intersex people have expressed great concern and reservations about navigating communal spaces of evacuation shelters and their bathrooms. We haven't been reported particular negative experiences, but we do know from international case studies that transgendered and intersex people have had very great problems in other disaster situations around the world where jurisdictions are less tolerant of sexual and gender diversity. What we have found, though, is that intersex and transgendered people we interviewed said they chose not to go to emergency shelters out of absolute fear that they would be discriminated against, and as such turned to their own community for support. So they turn to internal networks, families of choice, to be able to spend time with peers who they felt safe with, who might be able to temporarily house them and accommodate them for days to potentially weeks as required. So not negative experiences in actual abuse within the shelter, but choosing not to go to the shelters for fear that their transgendered or intersex status would become an issue and questioned by other people within the shelter. So it does have a real impact on people. And the other thing that we learned that was particularly problematic for transgendered people who were in a robust program of carefully controlled medications with their healthcare teams, that drugs that they might be taking on a regular basis to support their transitioning journey that need to be carefully refrigerated and temperature controlled, there was no possibility that they would be able to take those drugs and have them protected in a public shelter. So they had to find other ways of protecting that precious drug resource that they needed to support this life-changing process that they were going through. And it was also simply a conversation that they weren't prepared to have with a stranger at the check-in desk at the emergency shelter. As with many subsectors of our community, we recognise that individuals, families and communities can be sometimes vulnerable for a variety of reasons, including education, access to information, how wealthy a family or an individual might be, their ethnic status and so on. And that applies equally to LGBTI people for some of the reasons that we've begun to talk about today. It's only in the near recent past that equality is coming to people who are LGBTI, and we still haven't got there to full equality under law, all areas of the law. So for many LGBTI people, they are still feeling vulnerable for a variety of political, legal, social, cultural and institutional reasons. But at the same time, we see great resilience within the LGBTI people and their communities. They've learned to live with difference over many, many years. They find ways of working within the existing system so that they can do the things that they want on a day-to-day basis, live their lives in a proud, open and capable way. And that capacity to be resilient in a wider society, to usurp the existing structures, to be powerful in spite of legislation that might prevent you living your life the way you normally would, engenders a sense of coping and capacity that actually is transferred into post-disaster situations in many instances. So this idea of families of choice, networks of community who are like-minded, then come into play and support one another in post-disaster situations. So these nodes, these networks, these support structures provide insights that can be transferred into the wider community, that we can learn lessons about resilience and mutual support, respect, and helping one another in post-disaster situations. And so that resilience is something that we see over and over with members of the LGBTI community in different types of disaster situations. So with the federal strategy about national disaster resilience, talking about shared partnerships between community, government, the private sector and emergency service organisations applies to everyone equally, and LGBTI people are members of a wider community. So there's communities within spaces and places. And so LGBTI people do understand that sort of shared responsibility and have structures of mutual support. But that plays out and actually reflects the wider strategy for shared responsibility and shared structural support in response to the threats, the natural hazards and other types of disasters that can present to us. Unfortunately, both within the case studies in Australia and New Zealand that we've looked at, so the Christchurch earthquakes in 2010-2011, Queensland floods in 2011, and bushfires in Victoria and New South Wales, LGBTI people have reported to us over and over that they have been stigmatised in local communities, that some religious organisations talk about how LGBTI people are responsible for bringing these disasters on the wider community. This parallels experiences in other parts of the world. The large earthquake disaster in Haiti in 2010, Hurricane Katrina in the United States in 2005, were all characterised by extreme right-wing organisations demonising LGBTI people and the people that support them in terms of bringing legislative equality as bringing down the wrath of God, whoever that organisation's God is. And unfortunately that has happened in multiple countries, in multiple disaster situations, and here in Australia. And once again, in the post-disaster situation, when you're trying to deal with the stress of the damage or loss of your home and your possessions, when your business is on the brink of collapse, the very last thing you need are religious organisations pointing the finger and just making things more and more difficult. Coupled to the issue of the way in which some religious organisations speak about the role LGBTI people play in bringing on disasters, recent policy analysis by the team of which I'm a part of has really sort of unpacked what we've referred to as a policy paradox. So the case study we've worked on is in the state of New South Wales in Australia, and what we showed is that the government has outsourced response and recovery arrangements to third-party religious, in the case of New South Wales, Christian organisations. So LGBTI people abide by the laws, rules and regulations of the state, and they pay their taxes. The government takes that tax money and then, as part of response and recovery arrangements, provides money to these Christian organisations to provide response and recovery arrangements. So, for example, ADRA is one organisation that provides some response and recovery arrangements. St Vincent de Paul's is another. The Salvation Army is the third. At the same time that these third-party Christian organisations have been provided with taxpayer money to provide response and recovery arrangements, they've simultaneously been granted exemptions to anti-discrimination laws, meaning that they reserve the right to, and in some situations have, withheld service to LGBTI people on the grounds of religious discrimination, that they are permitted to do so under those anti-discrimination laws. So this paradox arises where they're granted and given money to provide a community service, but are simultaneously allowed to discriminate against some members of that community. Now, we don't suggest that those organisations deliberately seek to exclude LGBTI people, but we have been spoken to by LGBTI people who have said, I wish to volunteer my services to be a part of my community. I offered my service to this organisation and my service was denied because they knew that I was an LGBTI person. So that person didn't fulfil their maximum human potential and they felt that they were a second-class citizen on the basis of their gender or sexual identity. And the other situation that has emerged are that LGBTI people have said, I have not gone to the emergency shelter, or I have not gone to that organisation to seek the service that I'm entitled to because I fear the discrimination that will be applied to me because I am lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered or intersex. So there is an issue, and we're sensitive to this, and once again we acknowledge the amazing work done by individuals and organisations. But for us, we have a difficulty in accepting this policy paradox where taxpayer money made by LGBTI people could, in practice, be withheld from those individuals on the basis of religious intolerance or discrimination. The specific needs that people have vary from place to place and in relationship to the type of disaster they've experienced. But I suppose there have been some key things that have come up that are common. One is around recognition, tolerance and acceptance. I'm just a regular person. We're just a regular family. We're just like everyone else. Our sexual or gender identities shouldn't matter, but those sexual and gender identities do matter to those individuals and to the organisations that are providing recovery or support or response activities. So identity and how that plays out in a real world sense matters to many of the people that we've talked about. Access to resources to recover is an issue that's come up over and over, both positive experiences and negative. So people fearing that they wouldn't receive response and recovery support, but in fact having really positive experiences, and other LGBTI people not seeking the support that they're entitled to under law out of fear that they will be discriminated against. The safety of the home and how that might be intruded into by emergency response personnel coming out to provide response or recovery support, and how the privacy of the home can be, if it's the right expression, invaded, violated by people who might not understand what it means to be LGBTI. Those were kind of common themes that emerged in each of the situations that we've encountered, together with a sense of is legislation on my side or not? Am I included in or excluded from entitlements that fall out of post-disaster situations? I'd say they're probably the four key issues that have emerged in the respondents we've spoken to in all the case studies we've looked at. No one we've spoke to has said they were denied access to resources, and that's a tremendous thing. We're so pleased that in none of the case study situations, none of the jurisdictions in which we've been in, has anyone been denied service or access to resources. That's a tremendous story. The negative that sits within that is that some individuals have not chosen to access resources that they're entitled to out of fear that they will be denied those services because of the prevailing social, political, cultural discourses or behaviours in their communities. They are the subject of day-to-day verbal abuse, intimidation in a wider secular society. As a consequence, they materially experience victimisation, isolation, marginalisation. As such, they fear they're not entitled to or are frightened to stand up and get access to the resources that they're entitled to. Increasingly, research is going on in Australia and internationally to explore the experiences, positive and negative, needs in relationship to LGBTI people, and that's a tremendous thing. But we really are in the infancy of understanding the vulnerabilities and resiliences of people in LGBTI communities. There is a lot that still needs to be done in terms of understanding the particular lived experiences and how they can be minimised, but also how they teach us wider lessons about resilience and rapid response and recovery, capabilities embedded within people and families and communities that can be shared across wider society. We need to understand more about how histories of policy and practice affects the actual lived experiences of people in different communities and in different places. There's very little understanding about the constraints that the emergency service organisations themselves experience. Our emergency service organisations do a fantastic job with the resources they have. In a perfect world, our governments and our communities would be able to give more resources to those organisations. What are the particular challenges they face in trying to be everything to every group within our mixed societies in different places? How are their needs catered for? How are they trained and equipped with the resources they need to respond to diverse communities? We know nothing about that. We know nothing about LGBTI volunteers and paid staff in emergency organisations and how their roles are both recognised, supported, rewarded and enabled to diversify and represent wider communities, but within those organisations themselves. So I think we need to focus research both on the LGBTI community itself, who are affected by disasters, but also LGBTI people in organisations and institutions that provide support. Coming back to the idea of faith, we know that there are many churches and other religious organisations that are LGBTI-led. How do those organisations and those individuals reconcile their faith positions with their positionality as LGBTI community members? And how can they also reach out as ambassadors to bridge the gap between government, LGBTI communities and organisations that provide response and recovery support? That's a huge opportunity that could lead to greater inclusivity and diversity between government and governance and response and recovery arrangements and the LGBTI community. And of course, there are LGBTI people who are out inside their organisations, and I think our police forces provide a great model in terms of having LGBTI community outreach officers in places. Well, maybe we could do the same in our emergency service organisations for individuals who are confident, who are proud, who are out and able to step up and be empowered to take those roles to bridge between the leadership of LGBTI organisations and communities and the leadership of emergency service governance structures and response agencies to help both sides of that community partnership understand one another's capabilities and needs and increase the capability of emergency service organisations to reach out to and engage with the LGBTI community. So we know that institutions are often shaped by the power and the leadership of the people at the top. So for me, one of the major steps would be for the leadership of our emergency service organisations in Australia to reach out to and in change within inside their own organisations our understanding of and tolerance and inclusivity of LGBTI people. It would be fantastic to have 10% of emergency service organisations occupied by members of the LGBTI community, if 10% of our wider society is LGBTI. I'm not sure of the exact statistics, but that's one that we've heard over and over. So there are lots of ways in which I think emergency service organisations could begin that journey of inclusion and diversity. Well, I think the first step is really having a set of policies within the institution itself, within the organisation, that is able to acknowledge and accept diverse communities, both within its own organisation and outside, that fosters the appointment of diverse members of its own organisation, that supports members of its organisation who are gender diverse and sexual identity diverse, that empowers those individuals to lead engagement activities with the community that they seek to serve. Training and awareness about the particular needs of LGBTI community members in disaster situations would help to raise awareness of the particular needs and experiences that LGBTI people might have. Outreach education programs that target specifically the LGBTI community so that they understand the particular challenges that the emergency service organisations also have to operate under would all be positive first steps in that direction.